Picture this. The winter of the year 800, in the heart of Rome. St. Peter's Basilica flickers with torchlight. A Frankish king kneels in prayer, broad-shouldered and towering over those around him, his golden hair catching the glow of candle flames. Pope Leo III steps forward, holding a crown wrought with jewels. With a single motion, he lowers it onto the king's head, and in that instant, the congregation roars, "Long live Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor of the Romans." That king is Charlemagne, and that moment on Christmas Day marks the birth of what would come to be known as the Holy Roman Empire. It was neither entirely holy nor truly Roman, nor even a singular empire in the way others had been. It was a dream made flesh, a resurrection of Rome's lost glory, fused with Christian authority and bound to the ambitions of Germanic kings. From this moment, Europe would never be the same. This coronation is our gateway. To understand the Holy Roman Empire, we must step back into the centuries before, when the ashes of the old Roman Empire gave way to the seeds of something new. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, Europe fragmented into a mosaic of kingdoms. The legions were gone, the imperial court dissolved, and what had once been ruled from Rome fractured into tribal lands, warlord realms, and small successor states. Yet, the idea of Rome, its laws, prestige, and order lingered in imagination. To be called Roman was still to invoke legitimacy. In Gaul, a Germanic tribe rose above the others, the Franks. Unlike many barbarian groups, they did not merely pillage and fade. They settled, built, and adopted Roman customs. Their king, Clovis I, converted to Christianity in the late 5th century, binding his dynasty to the church. From this decision flowed centuries of alliance between Frankish kings and popes, an alliance that would one day shape the Holy Roman Empire itself. The Frankish realm grew under the Merovingian dynasty, but by the 7th century, it faltered. Power fell into the hands of palace mayors, administrators who ruled in the king's name, but held the real authority. From this shadowed position, one family prepared to seize the throne outright: the Carolingians. Charles Martel, the Hammer, famously turned back an Islamic army at the Battle of Tours in 732, halting Muslim expansion into Western Europe. His victory elevated his family's prestige, and his descendants capitalized. In 751, his son Pepin the Short deposed the last Merovingian king and declared himself king with the Pope's blessing. For the first time, the papacy formally legitimized a Germanic dynasty, a precedent that entwined church and kingship forever. Pepin's reign laid foundations, but it was his son, Charles, better known as Charlemagne, who would expand those foundations into an empire. Charlemagne ruled from 768 to 814, and his reign transformed Western Europe. A warrior and statesman, he expanded Frankish territory through relentless campaigns, creating a realm that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to central Italy. By the height of his rule, he governed more land in Western Europe than anyone since the fall of Rome. But Charlemagne was more than a conqueror. He styled himself a bringer of order, protector of the church, and patron of learning. He reformed laws, standardized coinage, and enforced tithes. He summoned scholars to his court at Aachen, sparking the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of art, writing, and education. He made Latin the language of administration, preserving the intellectual bridge between classical Rome and medieval Christendom. His relationship with the papacy deepened over time. When Pope Leo III faced accusations and rebellion in Rome, Charlemagne intervened, restoring him to power. In gratitude, or perhaps in a carefully orchestrated move, Leo crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans in 800. This act carried profound symbolism. The mantle of Roman authority, long thought lost, was reborn in a Frankish king blessed by the Church. To contemporaries, the coronation meant that Christendom once again had an emperor, a defender of faith and order. To the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, which still claimed to be the true Roman Empire, it was a provocation. Yet to Western Europe, it signaled a new era. The dream of Rome fused with Christianity, embodied in a ruler of Germanic blood. Charlemagne's empire dazzled, but it was fragile. Medieval Europe lacked the centralized structures that had supported ancient Rome. Communication was slow, roads deteriorated, and loyalty was bound more to kinship and personal oaths than to bureaucratic systems. When Charlemagne died in 814, his son Louis the Pious inherited the empire. Though devout and well-meaning, Louis struggled to maintain unity. His attempts at dividing the realm among his sons led to civil wars. By the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the empire was split into three parts: West Francia, the seed of France; East Francia, the seed of Germany; and Middle Francia, a contested corridor stretching from the North Sea through Burgundy into Italy. The division was catastrophic for imperial unity, but planted seeds for Europe's future. West Francia evolved into the Kingdom of France. East Francia became the heartland of the later Holy Roman Empire. Middle Francia fragmented, its territories fought over by neighbors for centuries. Still, the imperial idea endured. Even divided, rulers in East Francia clung to the notion that they were heirs of Charlemagne, guardians of the empire, protectors of the Church. This dream of a universal Christian empire, stretching across Central Europe, would shape the identity of the Holy Roman Empire for the next millennium. Thus, the Holy Roman Empire's story begins not as a single creation, but as a fusion. Germanic kingship welded to Roman memory, sanctified by the Christian Church. Its birth at Charlemagne's coronation was dramatic, but its survival after his death depended on adaptation, compromise, and faith in the enduring weight of the imperial title. It was an empire that never fully matched the clarity of its name. It was not centralized like Rome, nor absolute like later monarchies. It was a web of loyalties, tribes, dukes, bishops, and kings, stitched together by a fragile thread. The belief that Europe needed an emperor chosen not only by men, but by God. And so, as we move forward, we watch this experiment unfold through centuries of glory and humiliation, reform and rebellion. The empire that began in fire and coronation would weather crusades, schisms, invasions, and revolutions. Its story is Europe's story, told across 1,000 years of triumph and tragedy. When Charlemagne died in 814, his empire passed to his only surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious. Devout and earnest, Louis dreamed of ruling as a Christian emperor who embodied moral order. Yet where Charlemagne had been a lion in war and an oak in command, Louis was more a monk upon a throne. His authority, while real, proved vulnerable to rivalries, shifting loyalties, and the unruly ambitions of his sons. Louis attempted to govern fairly, issuing reforms, sponsoring monasteries, and protecting the Church. But his decision to divide the empire among his heirs unleashed disaster. Medieval Europe had no tradition of primogeniture. Instead, kingdoms were often shared among sons, each demanding land and titles. Louis's empire, already fragile, fractured under the weight of family strife. By the mid-9th century, civil wars erupted. Brothers fought brothers, armies marched across blood-soaked fields, and bishops excommunicated princes only to reconcile with them months later. The empire's grandeur dimmed as internal discord hollowed its foundations. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun formally carved Charlemagne's realm into three: West Francia, ruled by Charles the Bald, which evolved into France; East Francia, ruled by Louis the German, which became the Germanic core of the later Holy Roman Empire; Middle Francia, ruled by Lothair I, stretching awkwardly from the North Sea to Italy, fragile and doomed to splinter. This treaty was more than political compromise. It was the funeral of Charlemagne's vision of a united Europe. From it, modern France and Germany traced their beginnings, while the idea of a Roman Empire passed into uncertain custody. The 9th and 10th centuries brought storm upon storm. Viking longships cut up rivers into the heart of Francia, burning towns and monasteries. Magyar horsemen thundered from the east, raiding villages, enslaving captives, and striking fear across the plains. Saracen pirates raided Mediterranean coasts. Under these pressures, kings looked weak. Local nobles, counts, and dukes assumed greater power, fortifying castles, raising militias, and defending their own lands. Authority flowed downward, fragmenting into what we now call feudalism. The emperor's crown remained, but it rested on heads unable to command obedience far beyond their own domains. The Carolingian dynasty limped on, its prestige tarnished. Successors to Charlemagne bore his blood, but not his brilliance. In West Francia, royal authority dwindled until the Capetians replaced the Carolingians outright. In East Francia, kings faced constant challenge. Powerful dukes of Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia held near-independent power. Yet amid this chaos, the memory of Charlemagne's empire still haunted Europe. The church yearned for a protector, someone to defend Christendom from pagans and heretics. Nobles craved legitimacy that only imperial authority could grant. The imperial crown, battered though it was, remained a prize worth seizing. That chance came with the Ottonian dynasty, beginning in the 10th century. The Carolingians had faded, but in East Francia, new strength arose from Saxony. Otto I, known to history as Otto the Great, ascended the throne in 936. He inherited a realm fractured by tribal divisions, yet he possessed qualities reminiscent of Charlemagne: military skill, political cunning, and an iron will. Otto tamed rebellious dukes, bound nobles to him through marriages and alliances, and placed loyal bishops in key positions. Unlike secular lords, bishops could not pass lands to heirs, making them ideal allies for a king seeking to centralize power. Otto's reign was defined by both warfare and statesmanship. He crushed Magyar invaders at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, a victory so decisive it ended Magyar raids permanently and secured his reputation as Christendom's defender. The Pope, grateful for this deliverance, strengthened ties with Otto. In 962, Otto marched into Italy, where political chaos threatened the papacy itself. Pope John XII, seeking protection, crowned Otto as Emperor of the Romans. This act formally revived the imperial dignity in the German heartland. Though the name Holy Roman Empire would come later, Otto's coronation marked the rebirth of Charlemagne's dream under Saxon leadership. Unlike Charlemagne's empire, Otto's was less about sheer territorial size and more about enduring institutions. He established what historians call the Ottonian system, balancing secular dukes with ecclesiastical princes, intertwining church and crown. He envisioned an empire not only of lands but of order, faith, and loyalty, bound together under God's chosen ruler. By the time Otto died in 973, he had secured East Francia, defended Christendom, and laid the foundations for an empire that would last in one form or another until the dawn of the 19th century. From Charlemagne's dazzling coronation in 800 to Otto's revival in 962, The story of the Holy Roman Empire begins with brilliance, collapse, and rebirth. What seemed lost after the Treaty of Verdun found new life in the hands of a Saxon king who defeated invaders, humbled dukes, and wore the imperial crown with confidence. The empire was never again the unified realm Charlemagne once ruled. Instead, it became a complex tapestry: kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, free cities, stitched together by faith in a fragile but enduring idea that there must be an emperor to guard Christian Europe, crowned not only by men but by God. When Otto the Great died in 973, he left an empire that looked secure from the outside. Magyar raids crushed at Lechfeld, dukes cowed into obedience, a pope ready to crown his heirs, but from within, it was an intricate clockwork of oaths, privileges, and personalities that needed constant tending. The Ottonian achievement was not a Roman bureaucracy reborn. It was a living web. Bishops who served as princes, dukes who expected honor in exchange for service, abbesses who governed vast estates, and a king who stitched loyalty together with journeys, assemblies, and favors. Otto II, Rur, 973, 983, inherited both the crown and the problem: how to keep this web taut while extending imperial prestige in Italy. He dreamed bigger than his father, plotting a more permanent Roman presence. With Empress Theophanu, a Byzantine princess, at his side, Otto II imagined a court that fused German vigor with Eastern imperial polish. In Italy, he moved against Lombard lords and pushed toward the south, where Muslim forces still dominated parts of Sicily and held strong in Calabria. His gamble ended at Stylo, 982, where imperial arms suffered a sharp defeat at the hands of the Calbid Emirate of Sicily. Otto II escaped, but the aura of invincibility cracked. The lesson was plain. South of the Alps, the emperor was a contender, not a master. His early death left a child, Otto III, and a regency run by two remarkable women, Theophanu and Adelaide, Otto I's widow. They kept the machinery humming, holding royal diets, confirming privileges, touring the realm until Otto III came of age. Few rulers better reveal the Ottonian imagination than this young emperor. Cultivated, idealistic, and steeped in Roman imagery, Otto III, 996–1002, carried a silver seal, declaring Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the renewal of the Roman Empire. He envisioned Rome not as an occasional stage, but as the permanent theatre of imperial rule. He raised his scholar ally Gerbert of Aurillac to the papacy as Sylvester II, reviving the legendary pairing of Constantine and Sylvester, and signalling that emperor and pope could operate as partners in a single Christian commonwealth. But Italy had its own gravity. Powerful Roman families, the Crescentii and Tusculani, guarded their interests fiercely. German magnates balked at long Italian absences, and the imperial presence, if too heavy, bred resentment. Otto's project stalled in the friction of Roman politics. He died suddenly in 1002, barely in his early 20s, leaving behind more vision than structure. The crown passed to Henry II, 1002, 1024, cousin to the Ottonians, pious and pragmatic. Henry's answer to Ottonian fragility was to tighten the bond between crown and church. He deepened the Reichskirche, imperial church system, treating bishops and abbots as pillars of royal governance. They received lands and regalian rights from the king, and lacking heirs, could not convert their benefices into hereditary dynasties. Henry reorganized dioceses, encouraged reform-minded monasteries, and founded the bishopric of Bamberg as a kind of personal spiritual bastion between Bavaria and Saxony. In the east, He worked the diplomatic levers with Bohemia and emergent Poland, recognizing that conversion and bishoprics could secure frontiers as surely as walls. Canonized after his death, Henry embodied a specifically Ottonian ideal. The emperor as lay abbot of an empire of churches, where sword and crozier advanced in step. This settlement, crown and clergy interlocked, worked as long as each side respected the other's advantages. But inside it lay the spark for the Middle Ages' fiercest constitutional fire. If bishops were both spiritual shepherds and secular princes, who should appoint them pope or emperor? The question would break the peace and remake Europe. Beyond the palace and the cloister, the Ottonian world changed rapidly. In Saxony, margraves extended frontier rule into the Elbe-Saale basin. East of the river, missions groped towards Slavic peoples with mixed results. The uprising of 983 rolled back German and ecclesiastical outposts, a reminder that conversion was not a straight road. In the south, Regensburg, Augsburg, and Passau flourished as ecclesiastical hubs. To the west, Mainz and Cologne presided over trade arteries. In Quedlinburg, imperial assemblies convened under the patronage of royal women. A distinct Ottonian signature, the empire pulsed with itinerant kingship. The rulers' court chaplains, justiciars, notaries moved constantly, making law on the road, confirming immunities, receiving homage, and binding the whole with the visible presence of rule. Yet the sightlines were changing. A new religious wind blew from Burgundy and Aquitaine. The Cluniac reform. It demanded free election of abbots, clerical celibacy, and freedom from lay control. What began as monastic renewal carried a political edge. If abbots should be free of lords, what of bishops? If simony buying and selling church office was a stain, who had the right to wash it away? The questions sharpened with the next dynasty. In 1024, the magnates elected Conrad II, first of the Salian line. He brought sturdier fiscal instincts and a cooler eye for the Italian chessboard. In 1033, he added the Kingdom of Burgundy, divided by Arles, to the imperial crown, extending influence to the Alps and Rhone. Conrad's strategy? Less visionary than Otto III's, but more durable, treated empire as a bundle of crowns. Germany, Italy, Burgundy, each with its own laws and elites, coordinated by an emperor who knew when to coax, when to threaten, and when to tour. His son, Henry III, 1039–1056, seemed to master that art. Personally austere, politically commanding, he strode into the crisis of the Roman Church like a schoolmaster. In 1046 at Sutri, Henry deposed rival popes and installed Clement II, then presided over a string of reforming pontificates: Damasus II, Leo IX, Victor II, all Germans or imperial allies intent on cleaning house. For a brief, glittering moment, it looked as if Charlemagne's old ideal had returned. A single res publica Christiana, guided by an emperor who championed reform. But reform once unleashed acts according to its own logic. The Cluniac instinct to free the church from lay control widened into a program that would bear a single, explosive demand: no lay investiture. If simony and clerical marriage were to be rooted out, the hand that conferred ring and staff, the symbols of the bishop's spiritual authority, must be a spiritual hand. Henry III's dominance postponed the collision. His early death, 1056, made it inevitable. His heir, Henry IV, came to the throne as a child under the regency of Empress Agnes of Poitou. Great princes, Saxons, Bavarians, Swabians, reclaimed space. In Saxony, resentments flared over royal castles planted like teeth across the land. The Saxon Revolt, 1073–75, erupted, pushing the young king to the edge until he clawed back victory at Hohenberg and Langensalza. Meanwhile, a new force consolidated in Rome. The reforming party itself, now convinced that the empire's grasp on the church was not a remedy but the disease. In 1073, the monks and clergy elevated Hildebrand as Pope Gregory VII. He was no courtier pope, but a granite will in a hair shirt. In 1075, he issued axioms, later gathered under the name Dictatus Papa, not a formal law code, but a thunderous creed. Only the Pope can depose bishops. Only the Pope may depose emperors. The Roman Church has never erred. The Pope's legates outrank all bishops. At a stroke, the ancient partnership became a hierarchy with Rome at the pinnacle. Henry IV, still consolidating after civil strife, needed bishops he could trust to govern and to fight. In Milan, the reforming Pataria movement denounced simony and clerical marriage, contesting the city's episcopal succession. The king's assertion of the right to invest the archbishop was both symbol and necessity. Gregory saw an emperor grabbing crozier and ring with lay fingers and called it sacrilege. In January 1076, at the Synod of Worms, Henry's bishops, many chosen by him, declared Gregory deposed. The king addressed him as no longer Pope. Gregory replied with the ultimate medieval sanction: excommunication. It was not just a spiritual blow, it had constitutional teeth. An excommunicated king's oath-bound vassals were released. Germany shuddered. Princes who had watched the boy king's hard hand in Saxony now had a holy pretext. The fabric of fealty frayed. Here, the medieval imagination met political reality in one of history's most indelible scenes. In the deep winter of 1077, Henry IV crossed the Alps with a handful of companions. Snow choked the passes. Wind scoured the ridges. He came not as a lord but as a penitent, wool-clad and barefoot, to Canossa, a fortress held by the redoubtable Countess Matilda of Tuscany, Gregory's steadfast ally. For 3 days, Henry stood in the courtyard as legend records it, fasting and waiting, while the Pope considered, was this contrition or calculation? On the 3rd day, Gregory lifted the ban. The absolved king wept. The Pope embraced him. Chroniclers would never agree on the sincerity, but the image struck like a bell. An emperor in the snow before a priest of Rome. The reconciliation was real but provisional. Henry's political problem was not a stain to be scrubbed in a courtyard. It was a nobility emboldened by the ban. Within months, rebellious princes elected an anti-king, Rudolf of Rheinfelden. Germany slid into civil war. Battles Flachheim, 1080, Elster, 1080, tore the realm. Princes hedged bets, bishops recalculated, and the Pope, judging Henry's relapse, excommunicated him again. The contest now had 2 fronts. In Germany, for the obedience of princes. In Italy, for the obedience of Rome. Henry fought like a cornered animal. In 1080, a synod loyal to him declared. Gregory deposed and raised Wibbert of Ravenna as antipope Clement III. With German and Lombard support, Henry crossed into Italy, battered his way through the Apennines, and entered Rome. In 1084, Clement III crowned Henry emperor in St. Peter's. Gregory VII fled, rescued by the Norman Robert Guiscard, whose brutal sack of Rome scorched the city, and Gregory's local support with terrible irony. The Pope died in exile at Salerno, 1085, reportedly saying, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." Henry had won Rome and the diadem, but the cost was staggering. The investiture war had opened fissures that would not close quickly. German princes had learned how profoundly a papal ban could weaken a king. The Saxon question, momentarily suppressed, simmered. The ministeriales, unfree knights, elevated to serve the crown, grew in importance as the king sought loyal administrators, not bound into the great tribal duchies. Castles multiplied. Speyer Cathedral, begun under Conrad II and glorified by Henry IV, rose like a stone manifesto of Salian might, even as its builder's authority bled away in the marches and bishoprics beyond. The quarrel outlived the men who started it. Henry IV's son, Henry V, forced his father's abdication in 1105, inheriting the crown and the conflict. The younger Henry understood the symbolism. Ring and staff were the heart of Rome's claim. He sought a formula that would salvage royal influence without the stigma of sacrilege. After years of skirmish and impasse, he reached an accord with Pope Calixtus II in 1122. The Concordat of Worms. Its terms were subtle because the problem was, in Germany, cathedral chapters would freely elect bishops in the king's presence. If dispute arose, the king could help settle it. The spiritual investiture ring and staff would be conferred by the metropolitan, that is to say, the church. The king would invest the bishop-elect with regalia, the secular rights, and lands by scepter, acknowledging the dual role without touching the sacred symbols. In Italy and Burgundy, where imperial presence was intermittent and papal interests more immediate, the sequence of acts differed slightly to protect ecclesiastical initiative. This was no clean victory for either side. It was a constitutional truce. The emperor lost the right to make bishops in the old blunt way, but preserved a procedural hand in elections and retained the expectation that prelates were also imperial princes with public duties. The papacy secured the principle that spiritual office flows from spiritual hands, and with it, a platform for the Gregorian, later called papal monarchy, vision to grow. Europe had been taught a new grammar: two powers, two jurisdictions, sometimes cooperating, often colliding, neither wholly sovereign over the other. And yet, beneath the parchment, life pulsed on. Monasteries in Hirsau and Gors kept pressing reform. Cluny and its daughter houses sang the long liturgies of renewal. In Magdeburg and Bamberg, schools taught grammar and song to the boys who would fill cathedral stalls. Markets bustled in Mainz, Regensburg, Cologne. Rivers glittered with barges. Fairs brought Flemish cloth and Rhenish wine under the same tent. The empire's cities, some soon to be free, imperial cities, were learning the habits of council and charter, a political literacy that would matter as emperors and popes wrangled. Most of all, the people learned to see authority as layered. A peasant in Swabia owed dues to an abbey that owed service to a duke, who owed loyalty to a king who must kneel for his crown in Rome. A bishop in Franconia carried a crozier that the church gave him, and a seal the emperor expected him to use in the king's court. The empire was not a machine but a choreography, and the struggle of emperors and popes had not shattered it so much as taught it new steps. When the dust of Worms settled, the Holy Roman Empire emerged altered but intact. It had lost the easy supremacy Henry III once enjoyed over the papacy. It had gained a clarified, if complicated, understanding of where king and priest begin and end. Charlemagne's mantle no longer sat on one pair of shoulders. It lay stretched across an archipelago of powers, dukes and bishops, abbots and counts, emperors and popes. The next act will test whether a single will can knit those islands together again. A towering red-bearded Swabian will try Frederick Barbarossa, and the road will run through Alpine passes, Italian communes, and the old Roman dream that never quite dies. But that is the story of our next segment. When the investiture controversy ended with the Concordat of Worms in 1122, the Holy Roman Empire had weathered a storm but at a cost. Imperial prestige was dented, noble independence had deepened, and the papacy had proven that even emperors could be checked. Yet the empire endured. And into the 12th century rose a figure who seemed born to restore its grandeur. Frederick I Barbarossa. Born of the Hohenstaufen line in Swabia, Frederick was elected king in 1152 and crowned emperor in 1155. His nickname, Barbarossa, Red Beard, carried the weight of legend. Chroniclers described him as both majestic and pragmatic, a man of charisma who understood the delicate machinery of the empire. His reign sought to heal internal fractures and reclaim the empire's Roman dignity. Barbarossa recognized that Germany's princes, dukes, bishops, margraves were too entrenched to be subdued outright. Instead, he bound them by consensus politics. Frequent assemblies where laws were declared, charters confirmed, and privileges granted. He traveled tirelessly, ensuring the king's presence in distant lands, strengthening bonds by visibility. Yet for Frederick, Germany was a base, Italy was the prize. The imperial coronation in Rome had long been the jewel of legitimacy. But by the 12th century, northern Italy was a cauldron of independence. Cities like Milan, Cremona, and Florence grew wealthy on trade, governed by consuls, merchants, and citizens who increasingly resisted feudal obligations. For Barbarossa, these communes were both opportunity and threat. They could fund imperial campaigns, but defied imperial control. Frederick crossed the Alps repeatedly 6 times in his reign, seeking to assert authority over Italy. In 1158, at the Diet of Roncaglia, he summoned legal scholars from Bologna to declare that all regalian rights, tolls, markets, mints, and courts belonged to the emperor. This was an echo of Roman law, wielded to reinforce imperial sovereignty. But to the communes, it was tyranny, cloaked in parchment. Milan resisted. Frederick besieged it, starved it, and in 1162 razed it to the ground, scattering its citizens. It was a warning. Imperial majesty would not be mocked. Yet repression bred unity. Other cities formed the Lombard League, swearing mutual defense against the emperor. Meanwhile, Frederick's relations with the papacy soured. The popes, jealous of their independence, saw imperial power in Italy as a direct menace. Pope Alexander III became Barbarossa's great adversary, excommunicating him after Frederick backed an imperial antipope. The struggle was no longer only military, it was ideological. Empire versus papal supremacy, Roman law versus communal liberty. The conflict reached its climax in the 1170 seconds. The Lombard League, backed by papal blessing, fortified towns, raised militias, and prepared to resist. In 1176, at the Battle of Legnano, Barbarossa led his knights against the League's forces. At first, imperial cavalry broke through, scattering infantry, but the citizens of Milan, fighting under the Carroccio, a great wheeled altar that symbolized communal independence, rallied. They stood firm against charge after charge. In the end, Barbarossa's army broke. The emperor himself was rumored dead until he reappeared, battered but alive. Legnano was not a massacre, but it was decisive. The myth of imperial invincibility in Italy was shattered. The communes had proven they could resist an emperor on the field. The aftermath led to compromise. In 1183, the Peace of Constance confirmed the autonomy of Lombard cities. They could elect their own officials, enact local laws, and maintain militias, provided they acknowledged the emperor's overlordship and paid certain dues. It was a treaty of balance, not submission. The emperor retained dignity, but the communes kept substance. This settlement revealed the paradox of the empire. Barbarossa wore the imperial crown and invoked Roman law, yet the empire was not centralized like France or England. It was a federation of lords, bishops, and cities, each bargaining for autonomy. The emperor was a unifier by prestige, not an absolute monarch. This decentralization, often lamented, was also the secret of the empire's endurance. It bent instead of breaking, absorbing tensions without dissolving outright. Despite setbacks, Barbarossa's reign embodied a revival of imperial authority. He presided over courts that codified custom into written law, strengthened the idea of the emperor as fountain of justice, and gave shape to the empire as a polity larger than any one king or duke. His use of Roman law forged a legacy that outlasted him. The empire was no longer merely Germanic. It was Roman by legal fiction and Christian by divine mission. Frederick also bound the Hohenstaufen dynasty to broader Europe through marriage alliances. His son, Henry VI, wed Constance of Sicily, linking the empire to the wealthy Norman kingdom of southern Italy. This union promised vast power, but also new entanglements, drawing the empire into Mediterranean struggles that would echo for generations. Barbarossa himself died in 1190 while leading the Third Crusade. Crossing the Salef River in Asia Minor, he drowned, a sudden and almost anticlimactic end to a titanic reign, yet his memory endured. In German legend, he became a sleeping emperor, resting beneath the Kyffhäuser mountain, his red beard growing around a stone table, destined to return in Germany's hour of need. This myth revealed how deeply he had come to embody imperial majesty in the medieval imagination. His reign closed the high medieval chapter of imperial ambition in Italy. The empire had asserted its presence, clashed with communes, defied popes, and compromised without collapse. Yet the struggle left enduring lessons. Italy could resist, the papacy could triumph, and the empire's unity would always be negotiated, never absolute. The Holy Roman Empire, as it emerged from Barbarossa's century, was less a centralized monarchy and more a concert of powers, bound by tradition, law, and the mystique of the imperial title. When Emperor Henry VI, son of Barbarossa, died suddenly in 1197, he left the empire not a dynasty of stability, but a fragile inheritance. His son, Frederick II, was only a toddler, born of Henry's marriage to Constance of Sicily, heiress to the Norman kingdom of southern Italy. The union of the German Empire with the rich, cosmopolitan lands of Sicily promised power beyond measure. As a child, Frederick was raised not in Germany's forests and castles, but in the sun-soaked courts of Palermo. There, amid Arabic scholars, Byzantine mosaics, Greek philosophy, and Norman chivalry, the boy absorbed a multicultural education unmatched in his age. He spoke Latin, Sicilian, German, and Arabic. He listened to Quranic recitations and scholastic debates. He wandered libraries where Aristotle sat alongside Christian fathers. From this crucible emerged a man both emperor and philosopher, soldier and patron, cynic and visionary. But while Frederick grew in Sicily, the empire above the Alps seethed with instability. Rival kings were elected, papal influence meddled, and the princes weighed their power. Only later, when Frederick came of age, would he return to claim his German inheritance and wear the imperial crown. Frederick II was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1220 by Pope Honorius III, and from the start, he was both dazzling and alarming. Chroniclers called him Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world. Unlike his predecessors, Frederick envisioned a monarchy not dependent solely on German consensus, but structured with Sicilian rigor. In Sicily, he promulgated the constitutions of Melfi, 1231, a sweeping legal code that centralized authority in the crown, limited baronial independence, regulated trade, and elevated royal justice above feudal custom. These laws read less like medieval compromise and more like the edicts of a modern state. Frederick drew upon Roman law, Arabic administration, and Byzantine models, crafting a monarchy of unusual coherence. In Germany, however, such centralization was impossible. There, Frederick bargained. He issued the Statutum in Favorum Principum, 1220, and later the Confederatio cum Principibus Ecclesiasticis, 1222, concessions that confirmed the independence of princes in exchange for loyalty. While Sicily became a laboratory of royal absolutism, Germany moved toward a federation of semi-sovereign lords. Frederick did not resist this. He accepted Germany as decentralized so that he could focus energy on his Italian kingdom. The dual nature of the empire deepened, strong in Sicily, loose in Germany. Frederick's brilliance shone most in his court. He surrounded himself with poets who pioneered vernacular literature, scientists who studied falconry and astronomy, jurists who codified law. He corresponded with Muslim rulers, debated theology with clerics, and patronized translations of Aristotle from Arabic into Latin, helping ignite Europe's scholastic revolution. To friends, he was enlightened. To enemies, dangerous. And among his enemies, none loomed larger than the papacy. The papacy had tolerated imperial strength under Barbarossa, but Frederick's ambitions terrified Rome. To the popes, the union of Germany, Italy, and Sicily under one ruler threatened to encircle and suffocate the papal states. Frederick's long absences from crusading promises and his interference in Italian politics worsened relations. When the Fourth Crusade in 1204 ended in the sack of Constantinople instead of Jerusalem, Europe looked for another expedition to redeem Christendom. Frederick took the cross but delayed, citing responsibilities in Sicily and Germany. Finally, under Pope Gregory IX's pressure, he set sail in 1227, only to turn back ill. Gregory excommunicated him for failing to keep his vow. In defiance, Frederick sailed again in 1228, excommunicated yet undeterred, and here he performed a miracle of diplomacy. Without great battles, he negotiated with Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt, securing Christian control of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth through treaty. In 1229, Frederick crowned himself King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, an emperor excommunicated, yet ruler of the Holy City. The irony was exquisite. While popes preached the cross, Frederick delivered results. But Rome was unmoved. Gregory IX called him Antichrist, accusing him of impiety and tyranny. The war between papacy and emperor escalated. Frederick returned to Italy, clashing with Lombard cities and papal armies. He won victories at Cortenuova, 1237, where his banner, the imperial eagle, trampled the Carroccio of Milan, symbolizing supremacy. Yet despite triumphs, the communes endured, and papal alliances regrouped. The struggle hardened into ideology. Frederick claimed to be the true heir of Roman Universal Empire, legislating in Sicilian clarity and fighting under the banner of the eagle. The papacy claimed to be the vicar of Christ, wielding power above kings. The clash was not merely political, it was cosmic. Who should rule Christendom? Emperor or pope? Sword or keys? By the Council of Lyon in 1245, Pope Innocent IV excommunicated Frederick again, deposing him in words, if not in fact. Though still powerful, Frederick found his authority eroded by rebellion, disease, and betrayal. In 1250, he died suddenly in southern Italy, leaving behind both legend and wreckage. His empire fractured. His heirs, Conrad IV, Manfred, and Conradin, fought but could not hold Sicily against papal-backed claimants from France. In Germany, Princes reasserted independence. The dream of Frederick II, of a universal monarchy rooted in law and culture, collapsed into what historians call the Great Interregnum, 1,000, 251,273, a period when no emperor held effective sway. Yet Frederick's legacy lingered. His Sicilian codes influenced legal traditions for centuries. His cultural patronage seeded Renaissance currents. His defiance of the papacy inspired debates about sovereignty that echoed into modernity. He was loved, hated, admired, feared, a ruler who seemed centuries ahead of his time, yet trapped in the medieval contest of altar and throne. When Frederick II died in 1250, the empire seemed to exhale and lose its shape all at once. For a generation, the Stupa Mundi had ruled as if the world itself were a stage set for his ideas. Sicilian codes, Roman law, Arabic science, German consensus. Then the actor vanished, and the scenery collapsed behind him. His son, Conrad IV, rode hard to keep what could be kept, but fever and faction beat him to the punch. His grandson, Conradin, was brave and very young. The crown that glittered in his imagination turned, in the hands of his captors, to a sword above a block. With Conradin's execution in Naples in 1268, the Hohenstaufen line ended not with a funeral procession, but with the hiss of a shocked crowd, and the empire passed into a darkness without a single lamp to guide it. Historians would later give the gap a name, the Great Interregnum, but names can tidy what life makes messy. In practice, there was not so much an interregnum as a crowd of claimants and a marketplace of loyalties. Princes learned that without a commanding emperor, their own light burned brighter. Cities learned that without constant summons to war, their treasuries filled. Bishops learned to bargain with both heaven and earth. Rival kings appeared like twin suns at dawn. William of Holland, Richard of Cornwall, Alfonso X of Castile, each elected by a faction of princes, each crowned with solemn rites, each outshone not by a rival, but by the stubborn autonomy of those who had elected him. None could compel the map to obey. The papacy, flushed with its victory over the Hohenstaufen, imagined a Christendom where the tiara steered the diadem. From Rome, letters flew like arrows, depositions, dispensations, condemnations, seeking to shape a political landscape that did not care to be shaped. In Italy, Guelph and Ghibelline factions fought as if the dead emperor still whispered orders. In Germany, the old tribal duchies, Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia had splintered into lordships and counties, whose rulers counted their privileges like coins. The empire had not disappeared. It had become everywhere and nowhere. A custom, a memory, a seal on a charter, a phrase in a prayer for the king of the Romans. Even when no such king could make the Rhine or the Danube bend. South of the Alps, Frederick's bastion, the kingdom of Sicily, hung on under his illegitimate son, Manfred, a handsome, mercurial ruler who fought with the grace of a dancer and the luck of a gambler. Manfred secured Apulia, made treaties, led charges, and for a moment it seemed the Staufen sun might rise again. Then came a French wind, backed by Pope Urban IV and Clement IV. Charles of Anjou marched in with hard men and a clear mandate. At Benevento, 1266, Manfred fell, his standard trampled in the dust of the Calore River. 10 years later, Conradin XVI, fearless, doomed, rode south to claim his grandfather's ghost and met his own fate at Tagliacozzo, 1268. His public beheading in Naples shocked Europe, as if a door to a room called Empire had been slammed and bolted from the outside. And yet, the empire was not a room, it was a corridor connecting hundreds. In Swabia, Franconia, on the Rhine and Elbe, in bishoprics and free cities, life went forward. Monks sang the offices, merchants tallied and prayed, councils met in guild halls under painted beams, new leagues formed for defense and trade, the Hansa to the north, associations of imperial cities farther south, learning to defend convoys with contracts as effectively as with spears. When no emperor's hand signed the peace, towns learned to sign it themselves. In that world of shared air and separate hearths, the princes finally admitted the obvious. Their confederation needed a center, not a tyrant, not a visionary, just a man who could make right look like law again. And so, in 1273, they chose a count who was known more for keeping than for taking, Rudolf of Habsburg. Rudolf's election surprised those who still saw emperors as bronze statues on horseback. He was tall and spare, with a soldier's economy of words, a face that could be severe without cruelty, and a habit of remembering the names of men whose hands were more calloused than his own. He came from the Upper Rhine, from a family that commanded obedience on a few mountains and valleys, and was unknown in the royal houses of Europe. But he understood the map as it existed, not as poets or popes wished it to be. His first task was not to reclaim Jerusalem or to preach reform. It was to make the office visible again. Rudolf toured, he held diets, he confirmed privileges, he demanded the return of imperial lands and regalia alienated during the interregnum, and crucially, he made a careful war against the one man whose portfolio of titles threatened to turn Germany's center of gravity eastward, Ottokar II of Bohemia. Ottokar had scooped up Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, a string of pearls along the eastern Alps, while emperors were in short supply. He was rich, ambitious, and unimpressed by a count raised to a crown. Rudolf answered the way medieval kings answered when parchment had failed. Alliances were bartered, oaths renewed, frontier lords courted, and in 1278 on the plain of Marchfeld, near the Morava River, the question of who would speak for the empire was put to the long lances of real men. The battle was vicious. Charges broke and reformed. Banners went down and sprang up again like wheat in wind. When the dust settled, Ottokar lay slain, and the road to Vienna was open to the Habsburgs. Rudolf did not keep those lands as imperial estate to tempt future rebellions. He invested them in his house. Thus, Austria became not just a prize but a home, the hinge on which Habsburg power would swing for centuries. He could be hard where hardness preserved the public thing. When magnates had converted Reichsgut imperial property into private patrimony during the interregnum, Rudolf demanded restitution. He could also be flexible, where flexibility bought peace. He confirmed the special liberties of imperial cities, accepted the de facto weight of the electors, and did not imagine himself Charlemagne. When the papacy hinted at resurrecting the old claim to dispose of the imperial throne, Rudolf, without bluster, made it plain that kings would be elected in Germany. If he lacked time or fortune to take the golden crown from a pope's hand in Rome, he did not lack the sense to act like an emperor where it mattered in the diets and borderlands, and chancery where the empire breathed. Rudolf died in 1291, without the flourish of a triumphal procession or the shame of a deposition. He died like a working king whose ledger balanced on the last page. He bequeathed to his house Austria and to the empire a restored habit of consent and command. More than ceremony was what Germany needed. His immediate successors were not Habsburg's power rotated, as it often did, to other great houses. The princes liked to test the limits of their liberty. Adolf of Nassau was raised and unmade. Albert I of Habsburg, Rudolf's son, won and lost and won again in a world that trusted the sword more than the pen. The long arc, however, bent toward a triad of dynasties, Habsburg, Luxembourg, who would take turns carrying the imperial title, while the electors more defined, with each generation refined the rules of the game. In that shuffle, The empire learned something Charlemagne never needed to know, that rotation can be as stabilizing as inheritance. If one house grew too bold, another could be invited in to cool the room. If the papacy grew too prescriptive, a king could be elected whose feet were planted more firmly on German soil than on the marble of St. Peter's. Meanwhile, the world itself shifted. The Black Death would come in the next century and write a terrible chapter across Europe. But even before plague, the late 13th and early 14th centuries pressed new shapes upon old communities. Flemish cloth and Rhenish wine, Baltic furs and Bohemian silver crossed markets under the permits of lords who learned to like tolls better than battles. Universities Paris earlier, Prague soon trained clerks who could keep accounts, pass Aristotle, and draft privileges that would outlast their signatories. The empire's strength, paradoxically, lay less in an emperor's fist than in 100 right hands signing together. The 14th century opened with a duel that framed the empire's new equilibrium. In 1314, two kings were elected at once, Louis of Wittelsbach, Louis IV, and Frederick the Fair of Habsburg. The double sun rose again, and the land glanced up. Which light to follow? The answer came at Mühldorf, 1322, where Louis broke Frederick's army and captured his rival. Out of that victory flowed a reign as emperor that tested the lines between throne and altar in a different register than Henry IV and Gregory VII had done. Pope John XXIII claimed the right to approve or deny the imperial crown. Louis IV claimed that German elections sufficed. The argument was not theological thunder this time, but constitutional weather, a steady, cold drizzle that soaked through cloaks. Louis answered the papal challenge in gestures that were both symbolic and practical. He entered Rome without papal coronation and received the imperial crown from the hands of the Roman people, dramatizing the claim that sacral oil was not a chain around a king's neck. He issued protections for imperial cities, supported jurists who argued for the autonomy of the temporal sword, and courted allies among those tired of papal taxes. He also knew when to make peace, and in his last years sought a reconciliation that the calendar, not malice, denied him. The empire's center of gravity drifted east in the best of ways when the Luxembourg dynasty rose with Charles IV, King of Bohemia, and later emperor. If Louis IV had fought to define the imperial crown's independence, Charles IV, 1346-1378, would codify the mechanics of choosing the head that wore it. His masterpiece, the Golden Bull, 1356, did two things at once. It stabilized elections by fixing the number and identity of the 7 electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, Cologne, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and it normalized the empire's pluralism by awarding those electors broad privileges within their territories. Majority vote would choose the king. Outside powers, including the Pope, would have no role in the act of election. In one stroke, Charles gave the empire clarity without centralization, order without uniformity. Charles was no mere lawgiver. He was a builder and a gardener of culture. In Prague, he raised a capital worthy of a king. The Charles Bridge arcing over the Vltava, the foundations of the new town, the grandeur of St. Vitus Cathedral, whose stones teach pilgrims to look up. He founded the University of Prague, 1348, the first in the empire. so that a river of learned clerks and lawyers would flow from Bohemia into chancelleries from the Alps to the Baltic. He invited German colonists into Bohemian lands and protected Czech rights in return, weaving a crown land with 2 languages and 1 economy. If Barbarossa had preached Roman law to secure regalian rights in Lombardy, Charles preached practical humanism, where learning, architecture, and law allied to bind peoples to place, while king and electors wrote rules. The Black Death, 1347, 1351, wrote grief. It scythed through the countryside with a blade no prince could parry, cutting families in half and leaving parishes to ring bells for themselves. Labour scarce, wages rose, serfs bargained, lords fenced fields that had once been open. In cities, the trauma sharpened guild politics Zunftrevolutionen, as craftsmen sought voice in councils, long dominated by patrician families. In the imperial cities, Nuremberg, Frankfurt, Strasbourg, Ulm's self-government matured under imperial immediacy. No duke stood above them except the emperor, and the emperor stood far away. They lent money to princes, hired Landsknechte when required, and passed statutes by council candlelight that glittered almost as brightly as crowns. The Swiss forest, cantons, Uri, Schwyz, Unterwalden, signed pacts for mutual defence at the close of the 13th century, mountain men binding themselves with a clarity as cold as the lakes they lived beside. When Habsburg bailiffs pressed too hard, the Swiss answered on narrow passes where cavalry could not charge. At Morgarten, 1315, and later at Sempak, 1386, they wielded halberd and pike in close order, and found that discipline, courage, and terrain could erase the advantage of noble birth. Their confederation would grow, bit by stubborn bit, a reminder that beneath the empire's broad canopy grew trees that would not be pruned. The Habsburgs learned a lesson they never forgot. Austria was a chest of drawers, you filled by marriage and treaty as much as by sword. Indeed, a proverb was born that would become a dynasty's prayer: Bella gerent alii, tu Felix Austria nube. Marry. The logic of the phrase would mature later, but its seed was already in the 14th century. The Tyrol, a mountain key to the south, slipped by inheritance into Habsburg hands. Carinthia and Carniola were secured, Styria bound more tightly to Vienna. What the interregnum had taught: hold what you can, legalize what you hold, the Habsburgs practiced with devotions that kings reserve for relics. Yet, if Austria gathered, Bohemia flowered. Under Charles IV, Prague's court attracted poets and jurists, preachers and painters. The crown of street, Wenceslas, sat on a head that read Augustine at breakfast and building plans at lunch. The imperial chancery, fluent in Latin and German, and mindful of Czech, issued charters whose Latin could both sing and bind. If the empire had ever been a purely German thing, it was not now. It was a Central European lattice in which German, Czech, Italian, and many Slavic threads were stitched. The empire's courts and diets, meanwhile, learned to live with a map that refused to be ironed flat. Landfrieden, pieces of the land, were proclaimed in territories to restrain feud and private war. Courts of the electors judged like peers, circles of administration. Reichskreise would coalesce more clearly in the next century, but their shadows already lay across the parchment. Even theology prepared its quarrels. In Prague, a century before Luther, a preacher named Jan Hus would one day read scripture with dangerous clarity and awaken a movement that said crowns and mitres must bow to the word. The match had not yet touched the tinder, but the tinder was drying. Through it all, what outsiders called weakness often looked from the inside like habit. A French or English king might envy the emperor's title and pity his authority. A German elector might pity the French king's authority and envy his taxes. The Holy Roman Empire was not a nation in the modern sense. It was a constitution anchored in custom, a stage where many actors had roles and the script had margin notes written by dead men. It did not conquer so much as it endured, and endurance is a form of power. By the end of the 14th century, the empire had found a working rhythm. Habsburgs secured a heartland on the Danube. Luxembourgs proved that culture can be policy. Wittelsbachs demonstrated that an emperor could face Rome without abasing himself. Electors held their keys to the throne, with a grip that popes could no longer pry loose. Imperial cities stitched the economy together, with fairs and loans. Frontier leagues kept the peace, where the centre could only send letters. It was not Charlemagne's world, and it could never be again. But it was a world in which a word imperium still meant something. Not a single will, but a shared one. Not a straight road, but a recognizable path. On that path, the 15th century would bring new trials and instruments. Imperial reform, perpetual peace, a Reichstag that learned to sit and talk, a printing press that made arguments multiply, and the Habsburg strategy maturing from clever marriages into an empire that would one day stretch from Bohemia to Burgundy and across oceans to worlds no medieval dream had pictured. For the moment, though, our story stands on a ridge at sunset, looking back at the long interregnum where a crown almost forgot its head, and forward to a dawn where a family from a river valley would turn Austria into a hinge on which half of Europe would quietly swing. When the electors chose Charles of Habsburg as King of the Romans in 1519, they could hardly have imagined how wide his shadow would fall. Born in Ghent in 1500, Charles inherited through the careful marriages of his ancestors a patchwork so vast it strained the imagination. From his maternal grandparents, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, he received Spain and, with it, the burgeoning empire of the New World. From his paternal side, the Habsburg line of Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy, he gained the Low Countries and Austria. Now, with election to the Roman crown, he stood to bind Germany and Italy into his grasp. Chroniclers quipped that the sun never set on Charles's domains. Yet with such wealth of land came a poverty of time. He was expected to be everywhere at once. Burgundy and Spain, Rome and Vienna, the Caribbean and the Rhine. Charles was tall, fair, and marked by the famous Habsburg jaw. Though awkward in speech, he possessed a patient intelligence and a sense of divine mission. He saw himself as guardian of Christendom, heir to Charlemagne, the last rampart before the flood of the Ottoman Turks and the first sword raised against heresy. But history is rarely so accommodating. Even as Charles marched from coronation to coronation, a monk in Wittenberg was nailing words to a door that would shake the foundations of his empire. Martin Luther, Augustinian friar and professor of theology, had not meant to ignite a revolution when in 1517 he set forth 95 propositions against the sale of indulgences. Yet the hammer that struck the church door echoed like thunder across Germany. What began as an academic protest became, within years, a movement that questioned papal authority, sacramental theology, and the very nature of salvation. Charles inherited the crisis like a storm breaking overhead. At the Diet of Worms, 1521, he faced Luther in person. The monk stood, refusing to recant before emperor and princes. "Here I stand," he is reported to have said. "I can do no other." Charles, only 21, condemned him with the words of a young man certain of duty. A single friar against the tradition of all Christendom must be wrong. Yet beneath the emperor's declaration lay an uncomfortable fact. Many German princes admired Luther, some for faith, others for opportunity. They saw in his theology a path to independence from Rome's taxes and the emperor's law. The Reformation spread like wildfire. Pamphlets poured from new printing presses. Hymns resounded in marketplaces. Cities restructured their worship. Charles found himself emperor of an empire splitting along a fault line of belief. And unlike heresies of the past, this one could not be smothered by fire alone. It was carried by merchants, students, burghers, by the very people whose taxes and swords the princes commanded. Charles spent much of his reign shuttling between crises. To the east, the Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, advanced into Hungary, threatening Vienna itself. To the west, Francis I of France waged ceaseless wars, envious of Habsburg encirclement. In Italy, popes alternated between alliance and enmity, fearing Charles's grasp. In 1527, his troops half paid, half rabid sacked Rome itself, shocking Christendom with a violence that seemed apocalypse in miniature. And all the while, Germany simmered. Protestant princes organized into leagues, notably the Schmalkaldic League, to defend their faith and liberties. Charles attempted compromise in Augsburg, 1530, but the gulf was too wide. Swords spoke where sermons could not reconcile. In 1546, Charles struck. The Schmalkaldic War pitted imperial armies against Protestant princes. At Mühlberg, 1547, Charles achieved a dazzling victory, capturing John Frederick of Saxony and humiliating Philip of Hesse. For a moment it seemed the empire might be reunited under Catholic orthodoxy. Yet victory proved brittle. Resistance continued. The princes regrouped, and in 1555, at the Peace of Augsburg, Charles conceded what he had once denied. The empire could house more than one confession. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio, each prince determining the faith of his territory, became law. It was a compromise born of exhaustion, and it meant the dream of a unified Christendom under a universal emperor was dead. Charles, worn by decades of battle, laid down his crowns. In 1556 he abdicated, retreating to a monastery in Spain. The empire passed to his brother Ferdinand, while Spain and the overseas world went to his son Philip. Charles died in 1558, a weary titan, remembered as both conqueror and failure, builder of vast domains, yet unable to stitch them into harmony. His reign marked the zenith of the Holy Roman Empire's ambition and the beginning of its recognition that compromise, not universality, was its destiny. When Charles V abdicated in 1556, the empire did not collapse. It adjusted, as it always had, by bending. Under his brother, Ferdinand I, the Peace of Augsburg was confirmed. Each prince could choose Catholicism or Lutheranism for his lands. For a generation, this compromise bought breathing room. Germany's patchwork of faiths coexisted, if uneasily, but the settlement was fragile, for it ignored newer movements like Calvinism, and it left unresolved the deeper tension between imperial authority and princely independence. The Habsburgs continued as emperors, but their crown was now less universal scepter than balancing act. Maximilian II tolerated diversity. Rudolf II withdrew into melancholy in Prague, surrounding himself with alchemists and astronomers. Under Rudolf, imperial government all but paralyzed. Petitions piled up while the emperor gazed at horoscopes. Yet, in his court, Johannes Kepler studied the heavens, and the arts flourished in a way that seemed to mock political weakness. The storm finally broke in 1618. In the Kingdom of Bohemia, Protestant nobles, fearing encroachments on their rights, hurled 2 imperial governors out of a window of Prague Castle in the infamous defenestration of Prague. They survived the fall, but the empire did not survive the spark. The 30 Years' War had begun. The war that followed was not a single conflict, but a chain reaction. At first, It seemed a local Bohemian rebellion. Then, after the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, where imperial forces crushed the rebels, it widened. Protestant princes feared imperial Catholic triumph. Catholic princes feared Protestant leagues. Soon, foreign powers entered. Denmark joined, then Sweden, then France, a Catholic kingdom willing to fight against the emperor to weaken Habsburg dominance. Germany became a battlefield of Europe. Armies marched back and forth, consuming crops, burning villages, spreading plague. Soldiers lived off the land. The land died beneath them. Estimates suggest that in some regions of central Germany, populations fell by a third or more. Whole towns vanished. Chroniclers recorded not only battles, Breitenfeld, 1631, Lutzen, 1632, Nördlingen, 1634, but also starvation, wolves in the streets, and peasants eating bark. Yet amidst the chaos, new realities formed. The war revealed how weak imperial institutions truly were. The emperor, Ferdinand II, dreamed of restoring Catholic uniformity. His generals, like Wallenstein, carved power for themselves, but the princes defended their liberties fiercely, even as mercenary armies trampled their subjects. Foreign kings, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, Cardinal Richelieu of France, decided the fate of German villages hundreds of miles from their own capitals. After 3 decades of exhaustion, in 1648, the war ended with the Peace of Westphalia. The treaties signed at Münster and Osnabrück did not make the empire stronger. They made it looser. The principle of sovereignty was confirmed. Each prince could not only determine religion, but also conduct foreign policy, make treaties, and rule his land almost as an independent state. The emperor remained crowned and honored, but more as president of a federation than master of an empire. Westphalia became a milestone in world history. It signaled the birth of the modern state system, where borders and sovereignty mattered more than universal crowns or religious unity. For the Holy Roman Empire, it marked the end of universal ambitions. After Westphalia, the empire entered a long twilight. It still crowned emperors, always Habsburgs, but their authority was largely ceremonial. The Reichstag, or imperial diet, became permanent, meeting in Regensburg from 1663 onward, where ambassadors of princes and cities debated endlessly, but changed little. The empire functioned less as a state and more as a framework, a habit of legality and tradition that bound together hundreds of polities, duchies, bishoprics, free cities, knightly domains. Meanwhile, Europe changed around it. France, under Louis XIV, grew into a centralized monarchy. England forged a parliamentary nation-state. Prussia, within the empire's borders, hardened into a military machine under the Hohenzollerns. Austria, the Habsburg heartland, looked east and south, fighting the Ottomans and building a monarchy that was more dynastic than imperial. Yet the empire endured, precisely because it did not demand too much. Its legal courts still arbitrated disputes, its rituals still crowned emperors, its framework still gave legitimacy. A Saxon duke could still call himself elector because the golden bull still spoke. A merchant in Frankfurt could still trust contracts stamped with imperial law. The empire lived as parchment and memory, as seal and song, rather than as sword. The end came not from within, but from Napoleon Bonaparte. In the early 19th century, as revolutionary France swept across Europe, the old structures crumbled. Napoleon defeated Austria, reorganized Germany, and in 1806, forced Francis II to renounce the imperial crown. The Holy Roman Empire, which had once crowned Charlemagne and fought Luther, which had seen Barbarossa ride and Frederick II legislate, which had endured 1,000 quarrels and compromises, simply ceased to exist. Its territories lived on in Austria, in Prussia, in the many German states that would one day form modern Germany. Its memory lived on too, as a symbol of endurance through flexibility, of universality sought and never fully grasped.